Hi, so this is going to be a video on the multidimensional integrative approach to psychopathology, part 1. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about the different perspectives. So this is like a review of the topics we've discussed in Intro to Psych, Developmental Psych, and then also Theories of Personality. If you recall, we studied way back the different perspectives we take in attempting to explain behavior. So you're already familiar with, for example, the psychodynamic perspective by Freud and his fellow theorists. You also have the genetic perspective, neurobiological, so on, so forth. So here we're just gonna look at it in the context of abnormal behavior in an attempt to explain where and how do psychological disorders develop. So to do this, we first have to look at one of the most predominant models of the development of abnormal behavior, which is the Diathesis-stress model. So some people pronounce it diathesis, some people pronounce it diathesis. So I'm going to stick with diathesis anyway. So what's the diathesis? It's a predisposition toward developing disorder that can derive from biological, psychological, and or sociocultural causal factors. In short, it is a vulnerability. Okay? Whereas the stress is that life-changing event that causes us to react in a certain way. No? So when we talk about this model, we also need to talk about the distal cause, the proximal cause, and the reinforcing cause. Now, not part of the model are risk factors and protective factors, but we are going to talk about them because they're also very important things to consider. So, first, a distal cause. So, yung distal cause mo is a condition that occurs relatively early in life but may not show its effect. It may contribute to a predisposition to develop a disorder. So, let's say, for example, one of your family members has a history of depression. Okay, so we know that that's partly there is a link in terms of genetics to your predisposition to also having a the condition called depression. So that's one. So does anyone in the family have a history of depression? Do both of your parents' side have a history of depression? Or maybe, for example, when you were still in your mother's womb, something happened that influence the development of your nervous system or your brain. Or maybe early in life, let's say, for example, you experienced neglect. Okay, so when you experience neglect, you failed to develop certain functions behaviorally or maybe cognitively with the way you process information or the way you look at things, diba? Or maybe nagkaroon ka ng problem sa emotional regulation, so you don't know how to control emotions. So pwedeng ganon. So anything early in life that if you look at it, parang hindi siya pansinin, but it is something that can increase the likelihood of you developing a psychological condition if you encounter a certain amount of stress. So that's the distal cause. On the other hand, the proximal cause is a condition that proves too much for a person and triggers a disorder. So this can be very different depending on the person. So for some, it's the death of a loved one. For some, it's losing a job, or maybe for others, it's getting a failing grade or failing your expectations of your parents. So depende. It's varied talaga, and it can also it can also be pwedeng super biglaan or pwedeng gradual siya. Okay? So yeah. So another one that we need to talk about is the reinforcing cause. So let's say for example, diba, like you have, let's say for depression. Okay, so let's look at depression. So let's say there's this guy na may family history of depression sila. So yung family history of depression, that is yung distal cause. So may genetic vulnerability yung guy. Okay, so nakuha sa genes niya. Now right now that is a slight problem because we don't have metrics, clear metrics to measure your genetic vulnerability for psychological conditions. But let's say yun, may genetic vulnerability siya. And then, yung nangyari is, the person, let's say because of COVID, the person lost his job. Okay, so let's say, nung March may trabaho pa siya, nung April may trabaho pa, nung May okay pa, but then nag-announce yung company that they may retrench some people. Baka mag-retrench sila. So June, the guy lost his job. Okay, so that is the proximal cause if that event triggers a psychological disorder. Okay, so what happened to the guy? So the guy can no longer sleep. The guy kept thinking, I'm useless, I'm hopeless, this is going to be like this forever, magugutuman na ako, so on and so forth. And then wala na siyang gana sa work, because wala na siyang work, wala na siyang gana mag-apply for a new job, wala na siyang ganang sumama sa mga friends niya. And let's say, for example, the guy has a girlfriend. Now, that girlfriend doesn't seem to be very supportive. So, for example, when the guy expresses his concern and says something like, I'm very useless, nakakahiya sa pamilya ko, nakakahiya sa'yo. And let's say the girl responds, oo nga, actually, let's say she says, ang inutil mo kasi, kulang ka lang sa abilidad. So, let's say the girl constantly does that, diba? Very unfortunately, then that girlfriend is a reinforcing cause. She is a condition that tends to maintain the maladaptive behavior that is already occurring in the guy. So, weak ang support system. So, that weak support system. Okay? So those are the three causes involved in the diathesis-stress model. So we also have to be familiar with two terms like the risk factor and protective factor. So when you say risk factor, these are influences that increase the likelihood of an individual to develop psychological problems. So it can be something that has to do with, let's say, what is the age of the guy. Okay? If we look at epidemiological studies, we have indicators of kailan usually natitrigger yung depression, diba? Anong sex, biological sex ang mas common, for example, and then anong socioeconomic background. So, for example, if you're a guy na upper middle class, diba? If you lose a job, that's going to be very, very stressful. But let's say, for example, medyo may kaya ka naman. So, medyo nakapagpundar ka, may savings ka. So, it's not gonna be as bad or as impactful for you. Diba? If yun lang ang titignan. Versus somebody from the lower economic na group. So, let's say, parang below poverty line ka. So, syempre, if you lose a job, that's gonna be more stressful. So, your socioeconomic status is a risk factor. On the other hand, a protective factor is an influence that modifies a person's response to an environmental stressor, lessening the impact of the stress. So, let's say, for example, when the person lost his job, okay, so that's clearly a stressful event. Now, what if, for example, the person has siblings na may kaya and very supportive? So, yung siblings na yun will say something like, okay, you can work here with us. You're not gonna earn as much, pero at least you have something to hold on to and to use while you can't find work outside. So, 'di ba? So, even if you have the stress from losing your job, hindi siya mako-compound. Kasi 'di ba kung nawalan ka ng trabaho and wala kang ibang support system, saan ka kukuha ng pangkain? Saan ka kukuha ng panggastos sa araw-araw? But with protective factors in place, then hindi madadagdagan yung stressor that you're experiencing. Okay, so mamimitigate siya, in other words. So may kakainan ka, you can be sure na may matitirhan ka, or let's say for example you have friends who are willing to lend you money or to listen to you, or let's say for example you have a government that provides work for those who lost jobs, or you have like social security. So that is an example of protective factors. So pwede rin naman na yung protective factor mo or psychological. So let's say for example you have developed healthy coping skills. So that can be a protective factor also. Okay? So that is the diathesis-stress model. So remember lang, you don't just develop a psychological disorder because of one cause. It's always a combination of your distal cause and your proximal cause, and na worsen because of a reinforcing cause. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'll see you on the next one.